Hi, I'm Suzanne Turner, and welcome to a podcast delving into the personal narratives within the clinical research industry. Through candid interviews, we'll learn about the personal journeys and motivations of individuals who have chosen this profession, what I like to call their why. This podcast is not just for industry insiders. It's for everyone curious about the human side of healthcare. Beyond the industry's negative reputation, we'll shed light on the dedicated professionals behind clinical trials. Join us as we uncover the heart and passion of those working tirelessly behind the scenes in clinical research. Welcome to Heart of the Trial. Hello, lovely listeners, and welcome to Heart of the Trial, where we dive into the human side of healthcare. I'm your host, Suzanne Turner. Today, we're doing something a little different, but incredibly important. We often talk about how trials are run, how they're monitored, and how systems and strategy shape clinical operations. But today, we're stepping into the shoes of the patient. I'm joined once again by Amin Jagani, a seasoned leader in drug development and biotech strategy, to walk through the actual patient experience. What's it like from the moment someone is referred to a trial, to screening, enrollment, and beyond? What do they see? What do they have to consider? What tools support them, and which ones don't? Together, we break down a hypothetical case study and walk through it step by step, asking the question, would I say yes to this trial? And if not, what could we do better? If you've ever wondered how clinical research feels on the other side of the protocol, this episode is for you. Let's dive in. I hope you enjoy, and until next time, stay curious and stay compassionate. Well, welcome back to Heart of the Trial, Amin.
Hi, Suzanne. Nice to see you again.
I am very excited about today because this is going to be a special episode. You're actually going to walk us through what you're calling the patient journey.
That is correct. I would like to be able to walk a typical patient through all the different steps that they would expect to go through when they join a clinical trial from the beginning to the end.
Do you feel like by having this chat and informing people what they can expect as a patient, that it can help with patient enrollment or just in general patient engagement?
I do. I think it'll give patients. So, just to put it into context, I'm a lecturer at the local university where I teach advanced clinical research and drug development. And one of the topics I go through with my students is the whole patient journey, because the whole idea is we may be very busy trying to plan a clinical trial and we may forget the patient perspective, right? And so the patient journey kind of maps out right from the beginning what a patient goes through all the way, till the end of the study, and what are the benefits for the patient as well. So I think this will definitely put some of those questions out that patients might have, whether I should join, whether I should not join, into perspective, and then hopefully they can make an informed decision.
Well, I love it, especially because, again, I'm in clinical research too, but I've never been the patient. So I'm excited about what we are going to learn today. So, where do we start?
So, let's consider a typical clinical trial protocol.
Yeah.
The protocol, and so what I teach my students is, let's consider a fictitious pharmaceutical company. We call it Hygia Pharmaceuticals. And the protocol is within a certain phase of drug development. So for your viewers, clinical research is essentially one of the phases of drug development. When a drug is developed, it starts all the way from the bench through animal testing, through human testing, and finally it's commercialized. And the human testing can also be subdivided into different phases: phase one, phase two, phase three, and so on. So this trial is essentially a phase two study. A phase two study is a study that is looking at whether the drug actually works. We call it a proof of concept study, right? So let's assume in this particular study, it is for a specific indication or therapeutic area. We call it advanced hepatocellular carcinoma, which is a fancy word for liver cancer, right? And so in this particular study, we basically are looking at patients who are very, very sick And the study is a phase two randomized, what we call open label, which means that the patients will know what treatment arm they are in, and it's a two cohort study. In other words, there are two groups of patients that will be in this study. Now, just to preface the two groups, this study is for patients who have tried a certain treatment and the treatment didn't work. So, for example, in precision oncology or cancer research, one of the treatments is called a tyrosine kinase inhibitor or TKI, right? And so, if a patient tried that treatment and it didn't work, or if they tried another type of treatment called an immune checkpoint inhibitor and that didn't work, there's very few options for these kind of patients out there, right? So, what happens in this particular case is, let's assume that we have a typical patient. The patient's name is John Davis, and let's assume we have a physician, and let's give her a name, Dr. Jane Smith. And I've selected a hypothetical site. Let's call it the Princess Margaret Hospital in Toronto. That's where I'm located.
Okay.
And Dr. Jane Smith basically is treating this patient. His name is John Davis. The patient's been coming to see Dr. Smith for quite a few, years, and the patient unfortunately has developed his patient. Let's say the patient's a 62-year-old male, and he's got a history of liver cirrhosis. And now, 6 months ago, he was diagnosed with hepatocellular carcinoma. So the first thing Dr. Smith did was, there are some conventional treatments out there. So Dr. Smith put, John on a treatment called a TKI, a tyrosine kinase inhibitor. Unfortunately, the patient, after taking it for several months, failed on the treatment, right? So these kind of patients who failed on what we call the first line treatment have very limited options. Where do they go from, right? I mean, they've tried a TKI or they've
Right.
tried an ICI. Where do they go? So what happens in this particular case is Dr. Smith, within the context of Princess Margaret Hospital, would meet with her colleagues, right? We call this a tumor board or a cancer tumor board. And these cancer
Mm-hmm.
tumor boards are basically set up for different types of cancer. So there could be one for liver cancer, one for pancreatic, one for breast cancer, and so on. So in this case, if there are groups of doctors within that institution who come together and review patient files on a regular basis. So Dr. Smith goes to this cancer tumor board and says, listen, I've got a patient right here. I've tried this patient on a TKI. The patient unfortunately progressed on their disease. What do we do, right? And one of the people on the board might say, listen, there's a new clinical trial that you might want to potentially consider for your patient. And this trial is for patients who failed on first line therapy, the TKI. So then in that case, what Dr. Smith will do is go back to her clinic and work with her staff. And typically a staff at the clinic who works on research trials is called a research coordinator, right? So the
Right.
coordinator might actually look through the database of Dr. Smith and pick out, all the different criteria to see if this particular patient satisfies those. So in a typical clinical trial, the clinical trial is governed by what we call a protocol. A protocol
Right.
is a whole set of rules that need to be satisfied for the patient so that we can get the proper data to see if the drug works or not. So the study coordinator will essentially sit down with Dr. Smith and say, okay, let's look at John, 62-year-old male, see if he checks off all the boxes. For example, yes, he's got advanced hepatocellular carcinoma. Yes, he's over the age of 60. Perfect. Yes, he's got the fact that he failed the first line treatment. So he seems to be checking off all the boxes. Let's bring him in for a screening visit, right? So at that point in time, what's going to happen is that they will call, Mr. Smith and say, please come in. I think we might have something for you. We know that you've been struggling. You failed first line treatment. It's a new clinical trial. So Mr. Smith will come in and he will come in for what we call a screening visit. Typically what happens
Okay.
in the screening visit is the patient meets with Dr. Smith and her team, and they literally go over the whole clinical trial and they say, listen, John, you have different options, but at this point in time, I think we've kind of exhausted all of them. You failed on first line treatment. We've got this novel trial, right? In this novel clinical trial, you've got a 50-50 chance that you'll actually either get the new drug, we call it GT9001, or you might get the standard of treatment, what we call the gold standard that is currently out there, right? A drug called nivolumab. So it'll be kind of a flip of the coin, like a random 50-50 chance that you get one or the other. There are some side effects, so he will go over that. So the whole process is called informed consent. And the idea here is Dr. Smith and the coordinator want to be able to make sure that John is making an informed decision, right? They will go
Right.
over all the side effects of the therapy. They'll go through all the sort of the benefits of it, and the fact that it's a 50% chance that he may not get the treatment. If after all of that, John decides, no, thank you, that's fine, that's fair, right? He walks away. On the other case, he might say, listen, I want to give this a try. I'm at my wit's end. I've tried everything, nothing works. In that case, he signs this consent form. And the whole idea is to make sure it's an informed consent. That means there was no coercion, that he understands what he's getting into, and that there's also the benefit that he might be helping, other patients like him out there in case the drug works, right? I mean, that's what the whole idea of research is about. So he's contributing data, right? And so if
Right.
that happens and he agrees that he wants to go ahead, he signs the consent form, then the clinic, the coordinator will say to Mr. John, come on, for the next visit, let's say in a week's time, and we're going to do a whole battery of tests on you, right? That visit typically is called a screening visit. And in that screening visit, he might have, for example, a medical history, and they'll do a physical exam. They could do vital signs. They will do a whole bunch of lab tests, right? Blood tests, urine tests, et cetera, et cetera. They might even potentially, do some imaging, which is, essentially a CT scan or an MRI. The whole idea is that they want to kind of get a baseline feel for where John's
That's what
at, right? Because they
that's what
want
I
to know
wondered. Yeah.
where his cancer's at. So what they'll do is they'll perform the CT scan or MRI either of the chest, the abdomen, or the pelvis. And then the criteria that's used to determine the progression is something, it's a yardstick. We call it RECIST criteria. And essentially,
Okay.
that's what clinicians use to see if a cancer has progressed or not. So they will basically take the scans and they will kind of map it out using the RECIST criteria. And then they'll basically say, okay, you know what? You come back again once the lab results come in. We'll see if you met all the criteria. If you do, then you can proceed with the trial. Now, if we assume that all the criteria came in, John checked all the boxes, labs were fine, urine was fine, then basically what ends up happening is he gets the good news that, listen, I know you consented and now you qualify. At this point in
Great.
time, he's now brought in for what we call a randomization visit, or sometimes it's called a
Okay.
treatment initiation visit, right? In this particular case, it's called a day one visit. So
Okay.
John comes in with his family, and what ends up happening is that using a random computer flip or a flip of a coin, the computer will assign which treatment arm he goes into. So and remember, he's already been told that there's a 50-50 chance. Now, let's assume that he actually gets the treatment arm, right? Because it was a random
Okay.
50-50 selection. So now he's going to get the drug, GT9001 and nivolumab. And the way the drug will be administered is that he will get the infusions. So in this particular case, it's an IV, right? So the IV gets injected in him over 30 minutes. The first drug is nivolumab, and then he sits on this very comfortable chair. He gets an IV infusion. The nurse, will monitor the drips, and then after that, he gets the actual treatment drug GT9001. It's got a number because obviously it's still an experimental drug, and he'll
Okay.
get that over, let's say, 60 minutes, and then he's monitored very, very closely, right, to make sure that everything is
Hmm.
fine. And then if all goes well, that was his first visit, right? And he's told, okay, listen, because this is a type of a cancer treatment, you're going to come in cycles. So the cycles are every 2 weeks, right? So you'll come in for your next treatment visit in about 2 weeks' time, and we will basically give you the same infusion. And so this kind of goes on for an entire year. He comes in every 2 weeks, so cycle one, day one, cycle two, day one, like that. And then every 8 weeks, there is what we call a major visit, whereby they actually do a radiographic scan, again, a CT scan, MRI. Why? Because they're trying to see has the cancer progressed or not. So John gets into this rhythm where he now comes in. And remember, in these kind of visits, the site will actually work with a sponsor to make sure they cover whatever cost expenses that you incur coming in, right? So you're getting a whole battery of tests on you. Your expenses are covered. Sometimes patients fly in, sometimes they need to drive in from long distances. I mean, this is a
Hmm.
research study, so the sponsor will make sure that they look after you in terms of being able to meet your regular needs. And
Right.
what ends up happening is there's a few scenarios. So this treatment continues on one cycle after another, one cycle after another. The scenarios could be one that within that year, John progressed. Now, if John progresses at this point in time, Dr. Smith will meet with a tumor board and say, listen, we are looking at his scans using the RECIST criteria, and it looks like he's not going to be a good candidate to continue on. It's just going to be, doesn't make sense for him to continue on because his cancer is progressing. So at that time, he might have to be discontinued from the trial.
Hmm.
Another reason, another scenario might be that he's on this treatment for a full year and then he probably develops some kind of toxicity. It's possible. If that
Oh,
happens and they deem to be something that they cannot be controlled through like steroids or a temporary hold on the medication, then they might tell the patient, listen, you know what, unfortunately, we might need to discontinue you. Or the third scenario is what John is hoping for, is that everything is fine, right? He goes through the whole treatment and no issues in terms of stopping the drug, and so completes the whole treatment. So if that happens, then basically he completes the last treatment within a year's time. And the same happens for all the other sites. Remember, Princess Margaret was just one of the cancer sites. They might need another, let's say, 25, 30 sites within Canada and the US. So all the data from all the patients is gathered by the pharma company. And then literally, the data is locked. We call it a database lock, right? So now the patient is done. The patient went through all the different visits and they essentially their data has been captured. And the pharma company now essentially will get the statisticians to take that locked data set and start slicing and dicing the data, right? We call it statistical analysis. And what they're trying to do is did the drug meet its primary objective? Did the drug
mm-hmm.
meet its secondary objective, right? The primary objective was it better than no treatment at all, or was it better than placebo? And was it significantly better? And if that happens, then we say that essentially the proof of concept trial worked, right? The data readout that came out of this trial was positive. And then, what John ended up doing is he not only contributed his data to humanity, but he also benefited because the trial, worked and the progression was basically arrested. On the other scenario,
Uh-huh.
obviously, if the data was such that unfortunately they find that the progression happened despite this new drug therapy, then obviously the patients are involved as well and they are informed accordingly. So this essentially is how a clinical trial progresses right from the beginning to the end. And the benefits for the patients are: one, they get a novel treatment; number two, they get constant care, right? Versus like
Mm-hmm.
maybe having to make appointments with physicians and trying to get their attention. They're getting constant care. They're getting a whole battery of tests done on a very regular basis. And then finally, they could potentially benefit if the treatment works, and they're helping humanity as well, because obviously other patients will benefit from the data, which the company will use to submit to the FDA for approval. So that kind of maps out the
Right.
patient journey. I'm hoping that that kind of, gives you a sense
Yeah.
of what the patient goes through at least in a liver cancer trial.
It does, but I do have some questions for you based
Sure.
on this process that I think it would be good to dive into. So, first is when John was at his randomization um, visit, and this goes back to what you said earlier. So you said it's open label. So
Mhm.
he will be randomized. He might get the drug. He might get a placebo, which we'll talk about that in a moment, but because it's open label, he will know if he's on the drug or not, correct?
Correct. Correct. Because so
So,
remember, that's a very good question because there could be a trial which is called a randomized double blind placebo controlled trial. What happens in that case is nobody knows, right? What the patient is. The computer will do a flip, and whether John gets the active drug or gets the placebo, the only people who will essentially find out are like very limited number. It could be literally the
right.
statistician, the data folks, right? The sponsor doesn't know, the physician doesn't know, the people doing it, the site doesn't know. In this case, it's open label, which means we do know what he ended up getting. And that's why I said, let's assume he got the actual drug, and then this
Right.
is how he proceed.
Right. So, what do you feel like there's an advantage or a disadvantage over being on an open label versus a double blind? Is there an advantage to one or the other, or
Yeah, so the advantage is like if you are told that you're going to participate in a phase two open label trial, then I guess the advantage is that you know what you're getting. What you might end up getting, obviously, the other treatment arm as well. But then again, at the end of the day, the patient doesn't have control over what kind of design the trial will require, right?
mm-hmm.
So whether they are in a plus, obviously, if they're in a double-blind study and the study is an extended length of time, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is, then that's just the kind of risk the patient takes on because they will not know for a long time, what treatment they were on. But yes, so in an open label, they have that advantage that they will be aware.
Okay. And let's talk about placebo just in case we have any listeners that may not be familiar with what that is. Can you explain what a placebo is?
So placebo is basically a system that has been put into place to ensure robustness of the clinical trial. Essentially, what we are trying to say is, let's assume that a certain number of patients are getting the active drug, and a certain number of patients we will give them what we call a sugar pill, okay, or basically a pill that is masked like the drug, looks like the drug, probably colored like the drug, but actually does not have the actual drug in it. The whole idea we want to be able to do is, let's say if you've got a total of 30 patients and 15 got the drug and 15 didn't get the drug, is we want to be able to see at the end of the whole trial if we saw a statistically significant, meaningful difference between those who didn't get it and those who did get it. So, in other words, did the two separate statistically significant, or did it happen by chance, right? So the placebo actually ensures and allows us to make sure that the results didn't come out by chance. So therefore, you have what we call a control group that gets the placebo, and then you've got
Right.
a group that gets the active treatment. And so that's a standard procedure for clinical trials for many, many years since, I guess, the turn of the century, when we had, I guess back when we had some incidents when pharma was still developing, right? So now it's a standard procedure.
Right. And so, one kind of advantage to a study where you'd have a double blind is if individuals don't know if they're on a placebo or not, do you feel like there's less chance of any kind of, I don't know that manipulation is the right word, but like they might not even consciously be aware that they may give some kind of response, or they might be experiencing this or that, et cetera, because they won't know. Does what I'm
Right.
asking make sense?
Yes. So essentially, what you're saying is that the data would be much more robust if it's double blind or triple blind, because there is no chance of any type of bias, right?
Right.
Either on the patient side or the side of the administrations, like the caregiver or the nurse administering the drug, or the side of the physician who is caring for the patient. Everybody is blinded to it. So you would expect the
Right.
most type of robust data in that kind of a setting. And regulatory authorities really prefer those kind of clinical trial data, because you can really draw meaningful differences versus obviously an open label study. But sometimes you just have to do open label just because of the indication you might be in, whether
Right.
it's cancer research or whatever, where you want to make sure that you know what you're giving the patient, right? But ideally,
Right.
yes, the better data is from double blind or triple blind trials.
Right. And so, kind of, so moving on to a next question I have that kind of I think goes with that, because because the idea is always the patient safety, etc. So
Right.
when you were talking about the scenario, so like John's gone through nearly a year and they're looking at the results, and you gave us three different scenarios. Like it's his cancer's worsened, or the toxicity is impacting him. These two
Right.
scenarios, the whole point behind them saying, okay, it's time for you to leave the study, is because you're putting the patient's health first. Like, something needs to be done about this, correct?
Absolutely. And that's what I said is, in a clinical trial, unlike when you come for your routine physician's office visit, you've got a very close monitoring of everything, right? You've got visits that are happening like clockwork, and you're
Yeah.
coming in every 2 weeks, and they're doing a battery of tests on you. And the whole idea is patient safety. That's number one goal of any clinical trial, is patient safety. And the number two is data integrity, to make sure that the data they're collecting, as you said, placebo, open blind, double blind. And the number three is making sure they're following all the proper rules, like making sure they sign the informed consent form, they follow certain, rules, like we call them ICH, GCP, and then they follow the protocol that the sponsor has written, down to the T. That doesn't happen in a regular clinic visit, right? And so in this particular case, yes, if some of the indicators are showing that the disease has progressed, that the cancer tumor has progressed, they are obligated, as per the trial stopping rules, to be able to immediately, let the patient know that they will be discontinued from the trial. And at that point in time, we just complete what we call an end of treatment visit, and the patient and the patient understands that that's a possible eventuality. In the other case of toxicity, again, they will try and see if they can give a drug holiday, see if that helps. Sometimes they potentially might give some kind of a therapy to address the side effect, like a steroid. See if that helps. If none of that helps, then the protocol might have certain stopping rules again related to toxicity, and the patient might be told that you will be discontinued. And the whole idea being that the patient safety is paramount.
Right, right. Wonderful. Okay. So, another thing I think it would be nice to discuss, because you've talked about, like, in this specific case, it's a liver cancer. So, there are certain cycles and certain visits within that cycle.
Right.
So, it's during that informed consent, that initial visit, they'll go over the schedule expectations with the patients, right? And every study is different. So
Yes.
some studies they may have like more visits than other studies, correct?
Yeah, so I purposely chose a complicated cancer research study. There could
Yeah.
be a much more simpler studies. So, for example, let's choose a hypertension study, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, a hypertension study where a patient either receives a drug, an antihypertensive, or doesn't receive it. And the patient comes in monthly, and the drug is oral, and they will take the drug themselves at home, right, rather than coming into the clinic for an infusion. Regardless of the fact, when they are signing the consent form, the site investigator and the coordinator need to go through the entire what we call the study design, and as well as the schedule of assessments that the patient will go through, right from the time when they are screened to the time when they are actually assigned to treatment to when they come in for the regular visits. They will be told everything, and that's the whole
Mm-hmm.
idea. Then they will also be given the chance to go home and sleep over it. That's usually
Yeah.
what is the way it's supposed to happen. Then and they will be given a copy of the consent, discuss it with family members, and then they are told, if you still feel that you're ready, you want to contribute to human research and could benefit, come back to us and we'll enroll you. So the whole process is very transparent and is very focused on safety and monitoring for the patients throughout the trial.
That's amazing. And that's also when, because you talked about reimbursement. So that's also when they'll be able to talk to the patient about, like, they'll be able to reimburse for the travel because, like you said, they may have to fly or they may have to drive.
Right.
And I'm sure some other questions that maybe some of our listeners have, if they were interested, is, well, what if I have to miss work? What if, et cetera. So, what about those types of things?
Yeah, so those happens. I mean, life happens, right? So if a patient signs in and they expect to be able to come and honor all the visits that are outlined in the protocol, and they sign the consent form, and say somewhere midway through the trial, the patient experiences one of the life events, whatever it is, right, an extenuating circumstance, and as a result of that, the patient missed a visit or two. That might not be as problematic as if, for example, they miss an extended number of visits. If they
Yeah.
miss a visit or two, or maybe because of work they are late for a visit by a day or so, we call those window violations. They're basically deviations from the actual trial protocol.
Okay.
However, if they have a life event that actually requires them to, literally take time off, then they might, by the as a result of the protocol, might be withdrawn from the study, right? Because the study is very, very detailed, and it's very important that they meet those visit requirements. So that's something they're told right up front, that you're going to have
Okay.
some obligations you're going to need to honor, and if you can't, let us know in advance, right? And then there's
Mm.
usually even a little clause in the protocol that's in the consent form. Is the patient able to meet all the criteria of this protocol, the consent form? And the patient says, yes, I can. And then they go ahead and sign. But obviously, as I said, for those occasional misses, work delays, etc., it's fine. The other thing you mentioned about travel. So there might be patients who are coming out of town, right? There might be patients who
Hmm.
are not within driving distance. Sometimes what ends up happening is that Dr. Smith will call up the sponsor of the protocol and say, we've got an excellent patient, 62-year-old male, but unfortunately they live in Sudbury, which is about a 2-hour flight from here. The patient might, the sponsor might consider flying the patient in. Remember, all of these decisions have to be passed through what we call an ethics review board, right? The whole idea being we do not want to coerce the patient by paying them to be able to come in or give them some kind of incentive like flights or whatever, which might, as I said, be deemed as coercion, right? And so the
Mm-hmm.
ethics review board will potentially approve it. But in most cases, the sponsor will review and approve, the ethics board will review and approve, and then the patient can come in from wherever they are. Their expenses like parking might be paid, or whether it is taxi, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. So, like reasonable things that
Exactly.
you would expect to be covered just for
Correct.
them to participate, not like beyond.
Not
So,
beyond that people would question or regulatory authorities would question.
right. Okay. So, another question I have, or something I think we should discuss, is, and you kind of did when we talked about, more simple trial, they might have to take the drug at home. There are other things that they may need to be prepared to do at home when they're not in clinic for this, correct? Like some
Yes.
examples off the top of my head is like a patient diary.
Correct, correct. So sometimes what ends up happening is that not only do they pop the pill that they are supposed to take home, but they are supposed to record that dosing, right? So they'll be given either a in the past we used to give them paper diaries. Now they actually might get a
Mm-hmm.
little iPad, right? In the iPad they'll just go in and click on a screen that they took it at this time, and that data gets in real time transmitted to the site, and so the site can essentially record them within what we call the case report form, which is the database of all the data that's been collected, right? In some cases, these patients, for example, on a hypertension trial, might be given a cuff, where they will basically put the blood pressure cuff on their forearm, and they might be asked to take a blood pressure reading. That could essentially be transmitted data to the site. We call it, sometimes they use wearable technology. Like as trials get more and more advanced, these patients might, in addition to just taking the actual drug, might have other things they might be required to do as well, as you said, patient diary or wearables, etc.
Wonderful. That way, just, I think it's good for our listeners to hear all the different things they might be prepared for. So, what I'd like to ask you about now is because we've been talking about a scenario where they go into an office, but something that's become a very big topic and uh, patients may actually start seeing some is decentralized trials, where they may not actually need to go into a physical doctor's office. Can you kind of explain what a decentralized trial is and what differences a patient might expect?
Yeah, so a decentralized clinical trial is a phenomenon that really took shape when the COVID crisis hit, right? So just picture back about 4 years ago, when we were going through the actual COVID pandemic. There were a lot of clinical trials that were ongoing, and all of a sudden, you've got patients who are quarantined, clinical sites that had to be closed down. How do you get the patient's data, right? And so some of the ways the pharma companies went around it is sending nurses home to the patient, using appropriate, obviously, precautions and collecting the data that way. But then, as time went on, a lot of the pharma companies realized that we don't need the patient to physically come in. And so now we've got three different types of scenarios. You've got a trial that is completely what I call the traditional trial. So, what I gave you an example, the GT9001 hepatocellular carcinoma, that's your traditional trial. The patient has to come in because they got to sit on a chair, they got the infusion. Then you could have
Right.
the other extreme where they do not need to come into the clinic except in the beginning visit, potentially one in the middle of the year and one at the end. Otherwise, the whole time they could have wearable technology or they could have phone visits through telemedicine, or
Mm-hmm.
they could essentially have somebody coming to their home. But essentially, that opens up the possibility of recruiting patients from, you can imagine, rural areas that had issues with, geographical constraints to get into urban centers, right? It opens up a whole bunch of patient diversity opportunities. So now you can actually go to areas where patients were not able to potentially get clinical trials, right? And so that's a fantastic development, and FDA is fully for it. And so in that case, as I said, very little bit of interaction of going in. And then there's the hybrid, where the patients
Right.
might need to come in at occasional time points. So it all depends on the type of trial, right? If you've got an intensive care trial, fully traditional. If you've got a wearable technology hypertensive trial, fully decentralized, and then everything in between, which you call a hybrid trial.
Yeah, that's definitely been a very hot topic because of all the potential that we can see in it. Because if there are like some situations, there are only specialized doctors in a few places. Like, so let's say, the big places, California, Texas, New York. So
Right.
there are going to be a lot of people that getting to those doctors is really difficult in order to get the treatment or participate in a trial that may help them with the treatment they need. So I think that's really cool. Do you see this decentralized option being something that can help increase um, patient enrollment and engagement, like people being willing to participate because there's less, I guess you could say, almost time and effort, to actually going to the doctor, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is what's going to be the way of the future. And already a lot of sponsors and pharma companies, when they are designing a protocol, the first thing they're going to ask is, can we make this decentralized? Right? Is this trial open to decentralized model or design?
Mm-hmm.
And the whole idea being because not only is it cost effective, right? It is also, think about it this way, the data that comes from these patients who are, virtually connected through the study is in real time. So when you give a patient, for example, an iPad, or you give them a wearable technology, and they're essentially, dosing from home, coming in for very few visits, that data is coming in real time. Whereas in the past, you would rely on the patient physically making their way into the office, and then you can ask them, a whole bunch of questions, and then there is obviously some what I call a chronology time delay, right? And then so there's a cost benefit. And the third is patient enrollment, as you said. Imagine reaching out to rural areas, First Nations populations, areas in certain geographies or localities where
Mm-hmm.
patients would never typically come in, right? For whatever reason, because maybe they just cannot. Maybe they have issues with getting time off work. Now they have the ability to do this virtually, right, through telemedicine. So
Yeah,
this definitely will help boost enrollment in many of the trials as well. So I think it's a way of the future.
that's very cool. Okay, so you've walked us through this journey, this patient journey that they take from, their first visits all the way through their cycles to their final visit. What do you find are some really common questions potential patients have when, or why they might be hesitant to join a trial? And what do you usually like say to them?
I think one of the questions that might make a patient hesitant is, first of all, just lack of knowledge, right, about what is a
Mm-hmm.
clinical trial. Many feel that their data might be used in a way that they don't approve of. Many feel that, somehow there might be an invasion of their privacy, or that they don't know where the data is going to end up. And I think all of that has already been taken care of with very strict, stringent regulations for clinical trials, right? So, as I said, clinical trials are now very strictly governed by ICH GCP guidelines. They're governed by processes, protocols, SOPs, regulatory, oversight through ethics boards and through regulatory, agencies as well. So that's one thing that patients are probably, feeling a little bit of uneasiness. And the whole idea of us explaining in this podcast as well is to say to them that, a clinical trial is a robust research study, and what you're doing is you're helping contribute to human research, right, to potential treatment options. So that's one thing patients are hesitant about. I think another thing, as I mentioned, is the burden that clinical trial might have on the patient. And so the whole idea of sponsors is to try and reduce the patient burden. You can think of, for
Right.
example, a clinical trial in dementia or Alzheimer's disease. That trial might require bringing the patient into the clinic for a whole bunch of assessments. And usually you're talking about caregivers coming in, right? And
Mm-hmm.
bringing their mother or father in for a whole bunch of assessments. There might be some issues regarding, okay, can I make the time, the effort involved, taking time off work, bringing, mom or dad over in. And so again, as I said, there is options, right? Sponsors can make sure that they will accommodate a decentralized approach. There is obviously, as I said, they will accommodate for transportation costs. et cetera, et cetera. So the whole idea is that, that should hopefully not be a barrier, and that, patients should feel comfortable that they are, going to be looked after when they come into a clinical trial.
Yeah, that's great information. Okay. Is there anything else that you think that patients need to know being a participant before we talk a little bit about how they might look into getting into one?
Yeah, I think we covered pretty much the journey that a patient would go
Yeah.
through. I would say that there's a lot of patient advocacy groups out there, depending on the disease area that we're talking about, whether it is Parkinson's, whether it is Alzheimer's, whether it is, breast cancer. Be part of these advocacy groups, right? Join these advocacy groups as a patient, because many of these advocacy groups actually have a section on their website that shows you the latest research, right? And that
Okay.
could be a whole bunch of clinical trials that are currently ongoing that you could be a part of. So when you join these advocacy groups, that's when you get to find out the latest and the greatest, right? The R&D, the research that's going on in that particular area, whether it is precision oncology, whether it is rare diseases. Be part of these advocacy groups, because, as I said, you will make an informed decision, and you could be missing out on a potential trial that you could be a part of as well. And remember, when we are recruiting patients for studies, for example, in the case of Dr. Smith, one of the
Yes.
areas we look at is patient advocacy groups. We reach out to them and say, by the way, can you let them know we've got a trial XYZ going on, right? So it kind of works both ways.
And hopefully that makes the potential patients actually feel even more confident, because these
Yes.
patient advocacy groups are going to look at them and figure out what's going on with this trial before they just go and place it on their website.
Correct, correct.
Right.
And that gives them the extra support, correct.
Yeah. What are some other ways, if we have a listener who might be interested in joining a clinical trial, that they might be able to go about that?
So if you are a patient who, for example, has a certain disease condition, the first thing I would say is speak with your primary care provider, right? Your primary care provider, let's say it's a GP, might be tuned into potential options within research, or your primary care provider might refer you to a specialist. Yeah, let's say, for example, in this case, a hepatologist or a liver cancer doctor or oncologist, and they would be aware of potential clinical trial options. So in this case, Dr. Smith at Princess Margaret, uh, when John got referred to Dr. Smith from his primary care provider, that's how he got tuned or connected with this particular trial. Another way is to look through a website that has been created. It's a global website. It's called clinicaltrials.gov. And it's a website that anybody can access. It's not just for healthcare professionals. You can literally go into this website and filter out trials that are going on for various disease conditions. It's got an advanced search feature as well. And you'll see all the trials going on. For example, let's say you put in alcohol, liver cirrhosis, right? Or cancer or diabetes. And so that's another way. The third is looking through the advocacy groups. If you go through the advocacy groups of the Alzheimer's Foundation or the Parkinson's Foundation, all the trials are listed over there as well, right? And so I think there's many different ways, obviously, that you can try and be participating in a clinical trial. You just have to make sure you have an open mind towards it, and hopefully you can get the match to the right trial.
Wonderful. And I think one thing I really want to encourage any potential patients of is to ask questions, like throughout the
Yes.
entire process, during that informed consent, during everything, just ask questions.
Correct, correct. And I think that is super critical, because the last thing you want to do is, be midway in a trial and then have some surprises, right? So take that
Yeah.
informed consent home, share it with your family members, sit down over dinner, discuss with them what the implications are, not just for taking the drug, but the time commitments, the patient burden, et cetera, et cetera. And then once you're fully convinced that this is what you want to do, then go ahead and make the decision for the screening visit.
Wonderful. Well, this has been an awesome conversation. It was so informative. I'm hoping that all of our listeners feel so much more informed, and hopefully we'll get some volunteers out of it. But if they have any questions, where's a good place they can find you or other resources?
Yeah, so different resources they can reach out to, as I said, besides their primary care physicians. I'll give you my
Patient.
website and they can reach out to myself as well. They can talk to their healthcare providers, whether it's the local pharmacist, the local physician, the
Okay.
local nurse, any healthcare professional that is, caring for the patient should be tuned into where these clinical trials are registered, right? And so that way they will get access to firsthand information as well. And I think this was a great conversation. Thanks for hosting me,
Yes.
and hopefully somebody will benefit and make that right
Yes.
move and potentially give it a try.
Thank you so much, Amin. I hope you have a great one. This brings us to the end of today's episode. I want to extend my sincere thanks to our guest for sharing their inspiring journey. If you'd like to connect with them, you can find their contact information in the show notes. I also want to express my gratitude to you for joining us on this exploration of the clinical research industry. I hope you found today's episode insightful. If so, please consider leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. It truly helps us reach more listeners. If you have any feedback, questions, or comments about the show, feel free to email me at podcast@iceconsultingllc.com. Thank you once again, and I look forward to having you joining us on our next episode of Heart of the Trial.